In 1969, a 7-year-old girl vanished from her backyard in Yazoo City, leaving no trace whatsoever, plunging her family and the entire town into panic. The initial investigation quickly stalled when records went missing, witness statements conflicted, and a key officer overlooked a vital clue, causing the case to remain unsolved for decades. But through all those years, one family never gave up hope, believing that somewhere out there, the truth still existed. That is, until a small forgotten piece of evidence and an old Polaroid photo were rediscovered, revealing a detail that the entire investigative system had missed for 55 years. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you want to keep following cold cases being uncovered like this, don't forget to subscribe. Night fell over Yazoo City with the characteristic southern humidity, that heavy air thick with the smell of soil, pine trees, and the lingering heat from a long sweltering day. On the dirt road running along the edge of town, the faint yellow light from a few old street lamps cast small pools of glow, not enough to push back the darkness that was gradually swallowing the scattered houses. The Dwyer family home sat at the end of that road, a white-painted wooden house faded by time, backing onto the edge of the Lowhead Creek pine forest, where the sounds of insects and wind rustling through the treetops blended into a steady hum, familiar yet somehow quieter than usual, almost eerie. In the front yard, 7-year-old Rachel Dwyer was playing alone with an old jump rope. Her small feet patted lightly on the red dirt, each jump sending her thin brown hair flying up and then falling back in rhythm. Her mother stood in the kitchen, hands busy washing dishes, but eyes occasionally glancing out the window that looked directly onto the front yard, both to watch and to make sure Rachel stayed within the safe boundaries of the house, just like every other evening. The light from the kitchen spilled out into the yard through the window and the screen door cracks, creating a small illuminated area where Rachel was playing, while the backyard sank into thicker darkness. As it grew a little darker, Rachel suddenly remembered a toy she'd left behind the house from earlier that afternoon. She stopped jumping rope, ran around the porch, and disappeared from her mother's view, her small footsteps tapping on the wooden floor a few times before going silent as she turned the corner. In that moment, everything was still completely normal, to the point where no one thought it would be the last time Rachel was seen at home. A few minutes later, when her mother called her in for dinner and got no response, she just assumed the girl was absorbed in some toy. But the unusually prolonged silence prompted her to call again, louder this time, and still there was no answer. The father stepped out to the backyard, thinking kids sometimes hide or climb onto some steps, but the dark yard only answered with the steady chirping of insects and the black wall of the forest standing motionless behind it. They began searching around the house, under the porch, along the fence, around the big pine tree, behind the old garage, then along the path leading toward the woods. No sound of running feet, no snap of dry branches, no sign that Rachel had just passed through. Each search circle only made the anxiety swell larger. The father ran to knock on the nearest neighbor's door, hoping someone had seen her run by, but the answers were all the same. No one saw Rachel leave the yard, and no strangers had appeared nearby. Another neighbor, who had been sitting on their porch at the time, also confirmed they hadn't seen a child cross the road. The strange part was this: the backyard and surrounding area were too small for a 7-year-old child to vanish without leaving any trace. There were no hiding spots, no winding paths, and no unusual sounds. The mother went back inside with hands trembling from fear, checking every room, every corner, opening closets, looking under tables, all empty. When the couple stood in the dark yard, realizing that no reasonable explanation accounted for their daughter's disappearance, panic turned into a chill running down their spines, signaling something no parent wants to admit. With no other choice, the mother rushed inside, picked up the landline receiver, and dialed the sheriff's department with breathless urgency. That night, the Dwyer family had to utter words they never thought they'd say: their daughter had vanished without a trace. A tense silence enveloped the entire backyard as the sheriff's department vehicle pulled up in front of the Dwyer family's wooden house. The headlights swept a thin layer of white light over the still damp red dirt road, then onto the front porch where just minutes earlier Rachel had been playing. Two officers stepped out of the car, carrying a quick report notepad and basic flashlights used for nighttime surveys. They didn't ask many questions, only requesting that Rachel's parents point out the last place the girl had been seen. The mother gestured toward the back porch, where the kitchen light couldn't reach, creating a distinct dark area beside the side of the house. One of the officers turned on his flashlight, shining it on the wooden steps, then sweeping the beam down to the ground. This was the starting point of the investigation. The police conducted a preliminary recording. They marked the area where Rachel had been playing in the front yard, the path she took around the porch, the corner of the yard next to the old garage, the shadowed area from the roof overhang, and the backyard facing the pine forest. A simple sketch was drawn on the spot to identify 3 directions she could have moved if she left the last seen position on her own, into the forest, around to the dirt road in front, or deeper into the open space between the 2 houses. They also questioned nearby neighbors to confirm their lines of sight during the time Rachel disappeared. Although no one confirmed seeing her leave the backyard, these statements were recorded as necessary for analyzing the range. Next came the on-site forensic survey, simple and limited by 1969 standards, but still a required procedure. One officer closely examined the ground for footprints, skid marks, or slight disturbances in the damp soil layer. They checked along the wooden fence surrounding the backyard, looking for any spots that had been pushed hard, bent, or showed handprints from a child clinging. The underside of the porch and the area next to the back wall were inspected for slide marks, debris, or anything that didn't belong to the house's fixed structure. Everything was documented coldly and precisely. The first thing the investigation team noticed was there were no small footprints leaving the back porch. The ground, damp from the afternoon rain, would almost certainly have shown footprints if Rachel had stepped onto the open dirt, but the surface remained intact, with only old dirt streaks from a few days prior. There were no new child-sized impressions. This was the first anomaly, clearly marked in the notebook. The second anomaly appeared right when the officer shone the light on the area where she was last seen. Next to the porch was an open patch of ground, completely uncovered by tree canopy, where under normal conditions the kitchen window light should have been enough to illuminate the path. But tonight, that area was unusually dark, deeply so, as if the light was being absorbed rather than spreading out. The 2 officers checked the kitchen bulb, then the angle of illumination, no obstructions. This couldn't be explained by natural factors, and they noted it as the second anomaly. The area where the girl vanished was darker than reasonable. Both anomalies were entered on the same notebook page, then numbered sequentially due to their potential direct relation to the events. After completing the outer survey, the investigation team outlined 3 plausible directions. Direction 1, Rachel left the area on her own. This was weak logically due to the lack of footprints. Direction 2, someone took her, more consistent with the absence of footprints and the absolute silence. Direction 3, she had an accident, falling into a hole or small crevice, requiring checks along the side yard and soft ground near the forest. That very night, they checked direction 3 first, because it could be ruled out quickly. They groped along the low-lying ground at the yard's edge, shining lights into every crevice, lightly tapping suspicious spots to listen for hollow responses beneath the soil. But there were no holes, no subsidence, and no slide marks down the slope. This direction was nearly eliminated after just a few minutes of checking, marked as low priority in the log. Directions 1 and 2 were considered in parallel. If she left on her own, there should have been noise, footsteps, dry leaves, snapping branches, but no witnesses heard any. Inconsistent. Direction 2 was stronger. Someone carrying or leading her would reduce the chance of leaving small footprints, while also explaining the silence. However, confirmation required more physical evidence, and at that moment, there was nothing indicating an adult had stood in that area. While the family sat inside, trying to answer basic questions about Rachel's clothing, the time she ran to the back, and anyone who might have been near the house that day, the investigation team concluded the first survey of the night, with a preliminary finding: the incident showed no signs of voluntary departure, and leaned toward the possibility of another person appearing in the backyard within a very short window. But nothing was certain enough to announce. The scene was preserved as is, The area diagram was further refined with marking points, and the next investigative directions would be deployed. First thing the following morning. That night, the official search shifted into an urgent missing person investigation. The night in Yazoo City remained thick with humidity as the search team expanded the perimeter beyond the Dwyer family's backyard. The sounds of tracking dogs and the officers' footsteps disturbed the usually silent pine forest, where the ground was covered in dry leaves and scattered pine resin like a natural blanket. The only light sources besides flashlights were the thin moonlight, intermittently obscured by low clouds. The entire forest behind the house, which was just a few steps away, had now become a deep dark area, where even the smallest movement needed to be carefully noted. The search team began by splitting into two groups. One group swept along the forest edge right next to the Dwyer yard, while the other went deeper along the natural trail leading down to lower ground. The ground full of rotting pine needles made detecting footprints harder than usual, but it also had an advantage. Any new compression marks would stand out clearly if observed from the right light angle. The officers swept their flashlights over every square meter, looking for any disturbance, no matter how minor. Not long after, one officer discovered a series of unusual impressions. They were faint, elongated, not clearly foot-shaped, but it looked like something had pushed the pine needles aside. It couldn't be determined whether they were human or large animal tracks, but they were distinctly different from the normal forest floor. The officer marked the spot with a bright ribbon for the forensics team to check later. More importantly, the impressions were not far from the Dwyer fence. However, the distance was still enough to confirm that Rachel could hardly have made them herself without being seen from the front yard or the kitchen. Nearby, tracking dogs were released to pick up Rachel's scent. One dog paused briefly at the fence edge, sniffing hard at a spot below the ground surface, but the reaction quickly weakened. The dog circled back toward the yard instead of pushing deeper into the forest, an unusual sign. In cases of children wandering into woods, dogs typically charge ahead following the scent, but this time Rachel's scent trail seemed to cut off almost immediately after the fence. The two handlers drew a preliminary conclusion: there was no indication the girl entered the forest on her own, or if someone carried her through this way. The journey was very short, and the scent had mixed with an adult's. This further reduced the likelihood of direction one, the girl leaving on her own. The officers noted it in the report, and turned to examining the fence area, where two rotted boards created a small gap large enough for an adult to step through, but not easy for a child to crawl under alone. When closely shining the flashlight on the ground right there, the beam reflected off another unusual compression, pine needles pressed deeper than the surrounding area, as if something heavy or an adult had stood there. The compression wasn't a complete footprint, but the depth and spread indicated force much greater than a child's step. This was the most anomalous discovery in the outer perimeter since the start of the evening. The police redrew the area diagram on paper, from the fence straight to the backyard, from the forest edge to the trail leading toward the town center, from the compressed spot across an open patch toward the main dirt road. From these 3 points, they began considering the possibility of someone approaching from behind the forest, waiting at the fence, then taking the girl along the backlit path, where the Dwyer house lights couldn't reach. An older officer on the team, who had worked many missing persons cases, suggested expanding the check westward of the house to a rarely used path, this one connecting the pine forest to the grounds of a small abandoned farm from years ago. The search team moved to that area, following the tree line to look for any disturbances leading outward. Here, the ground was damper due to a nearby small creek, and any new footprints would show clearly. After a few minutes of searching, the group discovered a faint elongated drag mark on the soil, as if something had been pulled or set down and then lifted. No one jumped to conclusions, but the drag mark's position aligned exactly with where an adult might move to avoid sightlines from the Dwyer house. When returning to the compressed spot at the fence, 2 officers discussed the possibility of an outsider entering the backyard, without leaving child footprints. Preliminary analysis showed that if an adult carried Rachel, they could step through the fence gap without leaving small footprints, while also minimizing noise. This matched the neighbors' statements: no one heard loud noises or a child crying. The entire forest behind the house was grid-searched until the groups met in the low ground beside the woods. Though nothing belonging to Rachel was found, the investigation team collected a series of strange traces, compressed soil patches, faint impressions, a few freshly broken pine branches. There were no clear signs of a struggle, but also no clues indicating the girl left the yard toward the forest on her own. After preliminarily compiling all findings, the police established a complete topographic diagram, including the front yard, backyard, forest boundary, locations of disturbed objects, suspicious points, and areas where tracking dogs reacted weakly. By placing all the dots on the same map, they quickly identified the two most accessible points for an outsider. 1. The rotted gap on the north fence, where the compression appeared. 2. The crossing through the western wasteland, connecting to the dirt road out of town, without passing any houses. These 2 points were circled in red on the diagram, marked as entry-exit, high probability. This became the basis for the next investigative steps, as it suggested the incident might not be an accident, and not a child wandering off. No one said it aloud, but in the silence of the night forest, every officer understood that the direction of Rachel being taken was becoming the most likely possibility by far. As the search team began focusing efforts on the 2 suspicious access points marked on the topographic diagram, another group of officers continued sweeping along the dirt road, leading away from the forest, expanding the perimeter by a few hundred more meters. This was a route often overlooked on ordinary evenings due to low traffic, but that very characteristic made it a perfect choice for someone wanting to act without leaving many witnesses. Flashlights swept over the dirt and low grass, and just minutes later, a young officer froze upon spotting a small pale-colored object lying on the edge of the road. He crouched down, lifting it gently from the ground with 2 fingers, a child's light blue hair bow. The bow's fabric was dusted with dirt and moisture, but the distinctive white polka dot pattern was still clearly visible. The size and style both matched children's clothing, and immediately, this created a heavy silence among the officers. No one jumped to conclusions, but every gaze understood it was too childlike to ignore. The bow was found about 300 meters from the Dwyer house, far enough that Rachel could hardly have reached it on her own, without being seen by someone, or leaving footprints. The evidence was placed into a preservation bag, numbered Exhibit 1, with the discovery location and weather conditions clearly noted. One officer immediately asked the family about items Rachel had with her that evening, and after being shown a sketch, the mother confirmed the girl owned an identical bow. Though she wasn't sure if she was wearing it today, the similarity was too great to dismiss. This forced the team to re-evaluate Rachel's initial movement direction, from the front yard to the backyard, which was completely opposite to where the bow was found. This opened up a clear contradiction. If Rachel ran to the backyard, then why did an item linked to her appear in the opposite direction, much farther than the range she could have gone on her own in the dark? One officer closely examined the position where the bow was found. The item wasn't buried in the grass or under dry leaves, but lay on the ground surface, as if someone had set it down or dropped it while passing by. The fall direction also didn't indicate wind blown, because something that light, if carried by wind from the Dwyer yard, would have scattered along the road rather than lying isolated in one spot. Especially, there were no child footprints around the bow, not even any small prints matching Rachel's foot size. A forensics officer shone the light at a low angle to see the drop direction. The dirt particles clinging to the underside of the bow indicated it fell from a person's hand in motion. Soil adhered in a diagonal slope pattern, not the natural drop from wind, or a stationary fall. This was a small detail, but enough to confirm it wasn't an item left behind from before, but likely directly related to tonight's events. The ground area where the bow lay had a few disturbed soil grains, but not enough to show clear footprint shapes. These faint impressions better matched adult footsteps, long and deeply compressed, with a slight drag direction toward the dirt road, not toward the Dwyer house. One officer mentally constructed a model. If an adult carried Rachel away from the backyard through the fence gap, across the western wasteland, then onto the dirt road, the bow drop point was exactly where they stepped onto the wider path, where dropping an item would be more likely. Notably, the direction where the bow was found, didn't align at all with the direction Rachel ran to the back of the house. This contradiction tilted the investigation team even more strongly toward the possibility of a third party intervening. If Rachel had gone in the opposite direction from the backyard, the mother in the kitchen or neighbors on the porch would certainly have seen, as the view from the front of the house was quite open. That meant either she was led around through the back forest path then out to the dirt road, or someone carried her over the fence, reducing small footprints and noise. One officer noted carefully, the bow couldn't have moved itself from the backyard out here. Distance exceeds reasonable range for a 7-year-old in the dark. This cast clear doubt on the possibility of Rachel leaving the house on her own. Preliminary analysis of how the bow lay on the ground added another detail. The fabric was slightly tugged to one side, as if caught on a collar or hair then fallen, when the wearer was picked up or moved quickly. There were no signs of a drop from low height like when a child bends down to play, but more consistent with an adult's movement carrying a child. While one group reported on the new evidence, the other continued combing the ground around where the bow was found. No further childlike items were found, but one officer spotted faint compression marks heading toward the main dirt road. This was the direction the road could lead out of Yazoo City, and if someone wanted to take the child away without drawing attention, this was the ideal escape route. This first evidence discovery didn't solve the disappearance, but it broke the analysis deadlock, because it confirmed that Rachel or an item of Rachel's had appeared in a direction she couldn't have gone on her own. This significantly shifted the initial investigative directions, while placing emphasis on the possibility of an adult directly intervening at the moment she vanished in the backyard. And in that cold, damp night, the investigation team knew they had taken an important step, however small, in understanding what really happened to the 7-year-old girl just a few steps from her home before vanishing without a trace. The heavy footsteps of the officers still echoed on the ground as they began heading back to the residential area to take detailed statements from those living near the Dwyer house. The night had grown deeply dark, with evening mist settling in a thin layer over the roofs and front porches, making the yellow lights from the few houses in the neighborhood appear even dimmer and more blurred. In that atmosphere, the accounts of the witnesses, the only people who might have seen something, became the most critical point of support. But as soon as they started recording, everything immediately became tangled. The first person they spoke to was an elderly woman living in the house right next door. She had been standing in her kitchen at the time Rachel was believed to have disappeared, and was looking out at the front yard through the window, where the porch light cast just enough glow to catch movement. She said she saw a small shadow running past very quickly, low and small, heading toward the backyard. She wasn't absolutely certain because it was dark, but she insisted the shadow belonged to a child, not an adult. When asked for more details, she said the running figure seemed hurried but not panicked, like a child dashing to grab a toy and come back. The police recorded it fully, as this statement aligned with what the family described, Rachel running around to the backyard to retrieve a forgotten toy. But the second statement opened an entirely different direction. In the house across the dirt road, a middle-aged man said he was stacking firewood when he saw something he wasn't sure he should even trust. Under the faint moonlight and thick darkness between the two houses, he saw a child's figure walking beside an adult. He emphasized that they weren't running but walking quickly, as if trying to leave the area without drawing attention. He also described the adult figure as somewhat thin, narrow-shouldered, no taller than about 5'9". He didn't see faces, and couldn't tell if the child beside him was Rachel, just a small shape, hair hanging down, and movement that seemed rather stiff, as if not entirely voluntary. The officer asked again to be sure, "Did you hear any talking? Any footsteps or other sounds?" He shook his head. "Nothing, just the shadows of two people stretching long under the moonlight," and that was what troubled him. If it had been a parent with their child, they would have turned on the yard light, or at least there would have been footsteps or voices. What he saw was too silent, too swift, too much like avoidance. However, the contradiction arose immediately when they reached the third witness, a man living right along the main road, with a wide view of the entire exit road from the area. He had been sitting on his porch almost the entire evening, due to his habit of smoking after dinner. When asked whether he had seen a child or any adult leaving the area, he answered firmly, "Nobody left that place." If they had, I would have seen it. I was sitting right here, right in front of that road. His assertion was so definite that the police asked again to make sure he hadn't missed any moment, but he still insisted there had been no noticeable movement at all, let alone a child or adult crossing the yard or stepping onto the dirt road. In the first few minutes, the police simply recorded in silence 3 statements, 3 images that couldn't fit together under simple logic. One person saw a small shadow running alone. One saw a child walking with an adult. One saw no one leave the area at all. 3 pieces, but they didn't form a unified picture. But as they began probing deeper into each witness's vantage point, the pieces started to take shape. The elderly woman's view was from her kitchen, and couldn't clearly see the backyard, due to the corner of the wall blocking it. The man stacking firewood was standing in the dark gap between the 2 houses, where no house lights reached, so he could see movement in the backyard area that others couldn't observe. Meanwhile, the 3rd witness had a broad view, but could only see the front road exit. He couldn't see through the fence or the western area where the darkness was deepest. When cross-referencing all 3 statements on the topographic map, the police began to recognize a notable possibility. All of them could have seen a part of the truth, from different frames of view. The small shadow the first witness saw could have been Rachel running to the backyard. The scene the second witness described, a child with an adult, could have occurred in the dark zone the third witness couldn't observe at all. And the third witness seeing no one leave the area simply meant that whoever took the child didn't exit via the main front path. One officer carefully wrote on the board, 3 statements, do not contradict each other. Below it, he drew 3 arrows representing the 3 sightlines. Looking at this diagram, the investigation team immediately identified 2 possibilities. Either the child was taken through a completely hidden route outside all witnesses' lines of sight, or someone deliberately exploited the dark gaps between the houses and the rotted fence section to move without making noise. The atmosphere in the field report grew heavier. For the first time that night, the police clearly realized the incident wasn't simply the sudden disappearance of a 7-year-old child. It contained elements suggesting another person's involvement, someone who knew how to avoid light, avoid noise, and choose precisely the hardest to observe spots in the neighborhood. After completing the initial contradiction chart, they circled in red every point needing re-verification. The next morning, the exact spot where the firewood stacking man stood, and his actual range of visibility. The elderly woman's kitchen view, and the timing of when she saw the small shadow, the third witness's sightlines, and the blind spots he couldn't see. Every small detail was noted to prepare for reconstructing the movement path in daylight. But one thing all the officers felt right then: Rachel's disappearance hadn't happened amid chaos or a child's confusion. It happened in absolute silence. Silence enough for 3 witnesses to both see and not see the most critical things. And if someone had entered that backyard that night, they had chosen the moment with terrifying precision. The next morning, as mist still clung to the ground, and daylight began filtering through the pine canopies, a new report reached the investigation team. In front of the small grocery store in the town center, someone had seen a strange man appear in the afternoon before Rachel vanished. In a small town like Yazoo City, where nearly everyone knows everyone, the appearance of an outsider easily drew local attention. The store owner was the first to report it, saying the man's demeanor was unfamiliar, dressed somewhat sloppily, and seemed to be paying more attention to his surroundings than usual. The police immediately went to the store to verify. The owner described the man as around 30 to 40 years old, no taller than about 5'9", thin, with slightly long and disheveled hair, wearing a wrinkled old shirt and khaki pants the color of dirt. He stood for quite a while in front of the bread and candy aisle, the area where the town's kids often gathered, but didn't buy anything. What the owner remembered most was that the man kept looking out toward the road, as if waiting for someone. An employee also confirmed that he stood across from the store for nearly 10 minutes before leaving, but didn't talk to anyone. The police recorded the full description, then asked about transportation. The owner said he left in a dark green car, an older model, seemingly a Ford from the late 1950s or early 60s. The employee remembered a long scratch mark on the rear window, looking like it had been scraped hard. This piece of information was immediately noted in the investigation log, as these details were distinctive enough to identify if the car was still in the nearby area. One officer was dispatched to patrol the main roads in town looking for the suspicious vehicle. They couldn't be sure this man was connected to the disappearance, but in the early stages of the investigation, any unusual element needed verification. As the police drove through the small alleys around the town center, they spotted an old Ford parked behind an auto repair shop. The car's color was fairly close to the description, though the paint had faded. On the rear window there was indeed a scratch mark, though the shape wasn't easy to compare. The garage owner said the car belonged to a stranger who had brought it in for brake repairs the previous afternoon. The man used the name Caleb, no last name, and left the car there. The garage owner described Caleb as relatively matching the grocery store description: thin build, messy hair, somewhat distracted eyes, but the difference was that Caleb showed no signs of being in a hurry or trying to hide. He talked normally, with no furtive or evasive behavior. The police noted the information and opened the trunk, with the garage owner's permission since the car was in their custody. Inside were just a few tools, a jacket and some miscellaneous items, nothing related to children. The seats, floor and entire back area were closely examined with flashlights, but there were no signs of recently carrying a child, no fresh dirt, no small footprints, no fibers, nothing suspicious. When the police asked about the timing of Caleb dropping off the car, the garage owner confirmed he arrived around 3 in the afternoon, many hours before Rachel vanished. Caleb said the brakes were making noise and needed urgent repair, then left the car and walked toward the main road. The garage owner was certain Caleb left while the sun was still bright. No one saw him return in the dark. This shifted the initial suspicion. If the strange man at the grocery store was the same person who brought the car to the garage, then the time he was in town did not overlap with the incident. For further verification, the police interviewed a resident near the garage who had seen Caleb walking away from the area that afternoon. This person said he left the garage casually, hands in pockets, walking loosely toward the south side of town, the opposite direction from the Dwyer house. He didn't look rushed at all. If he had bad intentions, I don't think he'd walk like that, he said. Though it was just a subjective observation, it was recorded because it matched the garage owner's description. Finally, to definitively rule out or retain this lead, the police constructed a short timeline. The strange man appeared at the store in the afternoon. The man brought the car to the garage in the afternoon, and left before dark. No witnesses saw him reappear after nightfall. The car remained at the garage throughout the time Rachel vanished. Cross-referencing everything, the timing didn't match. The man was in town too early, and left the garage hours before the incident occurred. There was no evidence he returned to the residential area near the Dwyer house, and since the car, the most critical factor, stayed put all evening, the likelihood of his direct involvement in taking a child was very low. As the police concluded this initial sweep, they marked the strange man lead as eliminated step 1, but left it open under re-verify if new discoveries arise. In child disappearance investigations, any small detail could change everything later. But at the current moment, Caleb, if that was his real name, was simply a stranger passing through town on the wrong day. And this brought the investigation team back to the original question: if the outsider wasn't the key, then who or what had appeared in the dark gap between the two houses at the moment Rachel vanished? Later that morning, while the investigation team was still re-examining the Dwyer house area and cross-checking witness statements, the county dispatch suddenly received a call from the city of Meridian, over an hour's drive from Yazoo City. A night shift employee at the central bus station reported that around dawn, she saw a little girl who looked quite similar to Rachel standing near the waiting area benches, among a few other passengers. Though it was just a fleeting glimpse under the dim yellow station lights, she felt the child had long hair, a small build, and was wearing a light pastel-colored dress. She wasn't certain about the age, but thought the girl looked around 6 to 8 years old. The tip forced the police to respond immediately. In a small town like Yazoo, children rarely traveled far at night, so any report of a child appearing in another city held value, even if based on subjective impression. 2 officers were dispatched to Meridian right away, carrying the latest description photo of Rachel and a list of items she might have had with her. The Meridian bus station that morning still carried the smell of engine oil and the echoing sounds of the previous night's buses. The waiting area was sparsely populated, with only a few passengers awaiting early departures. The employee who reported led the police to the spot where she had seen the child, near Gate 3. She said that while passing through the area, she saw a little girl standing close beside a woman wearing light-colored clothing. The two weren't talking much, but the woman placed her hand on the girl's shoulder, a gesture that caught her attention because it seemed both affectionate and awkward. When questioned further, the employee said the child showed no signs of fear or resistance, just standing quietly looking around, as if waiting for a bus. Then, when the employee returned to the area a few minutes later, both people were gone. She thought they might have boarded the 03A bus heading toward Mobile, or the 07C interstate route. However, she couldn't confirm it absolutely, since she didn't see them get on. The police immediately requested to review the station's analog security cameras for the time frame from midnight to dawn. Due to the low quality of cameras in those years, the footage was blurry, only sufficient to identify figures and movement. After more than half an hour of reviewing, they found a clip showing a little girl standing near a woman in light-colored clothing, right at waiting area 3. But when zoomed in and played in slow motion, the police noticed two mismatched details. The child in the clip had slightly curly long hair and was a bit taller than Rachel. The woman beside her had a slightly stooped posture and carried her handbag in a way that differed entirely from distant witness descriptions of anyone seen near the Dwyer area the night of the disappearance. For greater certainty, the police tracked down the drivers of the routes operating in the suspected time frame. The driver of the 03A route said he remembered a woman in light clothing, yellow or white, boarding with a little girl around a little after 4 a.m., but according to him, the girl was about 10 years old, too old for Rachel. The driver even recalled asking if they needed help with luggage, and the woman responded in a thick Southern accent, showing no signs of hurry or evasion. He also confirmed the child walked normally, not carried or pulled, nothing like a case of coercion. The driver of the 07C route said he saw no little girl on his overnight run at all. However, he remembered a woman in light clothing traveling alone, without a child. In his description, she wore a thin ivory-colored jacket and worn old shoes. He didn't remember much more because the bus was quite empty at that hour. To solidify the details, the police showed all witnesses Rachel's photo. The results were consistent. No one was certain the child they saw was Rachel. The child on camera was taller, with different hair, showing no clear matching features. The driver's descriptions further weakened the Meridian lead, because the time since Rachel's disappearance wasn't enough to get her to this city by any reasonable means, unless the perpetrator had a pre-arranged very fast vehicle or she had been taken much earlier. But no evidence supported that theory. When the police compiled all the data, blurry camera footage, the station employee's statement, the driver's accounts, the Meridian investigation direction was officially marked eliminated step 1. There was no direct evidence the girl at the bus station was Rachel. Height, appearance, timing, travel patterns, all mismatched. This was clearly a false lead, likely stemming from the common confusion in child disappearance cases. However, one small detail prevented the police from dismissing it entirely: the woman in light-colored clothing. Though there was no evidence linking this woman to Rachel, the fact that she appeared at the station relatively close to the disappearance time, traveling with a child, even if not Rachel, led the police to flag her on the watch list. Not because she committed a crime, but because this coincidence could open another line of reasoning. Could someone else, a woman, have appeared near the disappearance area the previous night? The station employee noted that the light-clothed woman didn't talk much, just stood beside the child, as if waiting for a bus, but the hand-on-shoulder gesture was strange, not like mother and daughter. The driver described her as cautious in demeanor, minimally interactive. This wasn't evidence, but characteristics worth remembering. Thanks to this information, the police decided to note the woman's description: light-colored clothing, white, pale yellow or ivory, average build, shoulder-length hair, approximately 20-35 years old. Officers were instructed to recheck the list of overnight visitors in town on the night of the incident, seeing if any unfamiliar women had stayed. Though the meridian direction was largely eliminated, this detail could become a crucial piece in the future if any other evidence or statements matched the description. As they left the bus station, the two officers briefly discussed their impressions. One believed it was just confusion from the stress. The other thought every coincidence had a reason. But despite differing views, they agreed on one thing: Rachel had not appeared in Meridian that night. And this shifted the entire investigative focus back to Yazoo City, where the darkness, the rotted fence, and the conflicting statements awaited decoding. That weekend, after thoroughly checking the entire surrounding area, re-interviewing witnesses, and verifying tips from outside the town, the investigation began to show signs of stalling. The initial suspicious points, the hair bow dropped in an unreasonable place, the compression marks near the fence, the inconsistent statements, though suggestive, were still not enough for the police to conclude anything specific. Every subsequent direction led to a dead end. No new physical evidence emerged. No residents reported anything additional. No strangers returned to town. Rachel seemed to have vanished into thin air right after the moment she stepped around the dark corner of the yard. In the context of 1969, forensic technology was still very limited. There was no CCTV in residential areas, no advanced trace analysis, no databases for comparing shoe prints or DNA. The officers had only a notepad file, a few evidence items in nylon bags, and handwritten reports. Every page was reviewed over and over, but still no breakthrough emerged. The younger officers on the initial investigation team still believed that expanding the search radius by a few more miles might bring a ray of hope. But after many days with no results whatsoever, that optimism gradually faded. The Yazoo County Sheriff had to face the reality that the manpower and budget of a small town could not sustain an open investigation indefinitely. In the following weeks, no additional evidence appeared, no strangers were spotted, and no one received any information related to the child. As every lead was checked and closed one by one, Rachel's missing person file was moved to investigation suspended status, in accordance with procedures of that era. This did not mean the case was completely abandoned, but it did mean that active searching had to stop. As the file was prepared for storage in the county archives, the youngest officers showed reluctance to accept this, but their superiors reminded them that this was common in disappearances without clear leads. Sometimes, one had to wait for a new witness to emerge, or an incidental piece of evidence to be found before the case could be reopened. Dozens of pages of handwritten reports were clipped together, dated, but the thinness of the file reflected the investigation's helplessness more than the team's effort. While gathering all the documents to place into the official file, one officer noticed some notes left scattered on the report table, a few pages hastily written on the first night, a sheet sketching the fence location, some lines noting the second witness's statement, but without official confirmation from the recorder. In that year's procedures, any notes to be included in the file had to be signed, stamped, and arranged in event order, but those scattered notes did not follow chronological order, lacked signatures, and were placed in a separate subfolder instead of the main file. No one remembered exactly why those pages weren't entered into the file from the beginning. One officer said they might have been written before verification, so not included in the official part. Another said the recorder might have forgotten to add them. Whatever the reason, those loose notes were marked not meeting standards for official documentation, so they were stapled at the end of the file instead of in their proper place. No one in the room at the time thought this could make a difference. To them, they were just a few hastily written sheets, without legal value, not cross-checked. When the file was sealed with a metal clip and placed in the county's cold storage cabinet, not one officer on the team thought that scattered disarray would become the thing to change the entire situation decades later. At the time, it just seemed like a minor detail lost among hundreds of pages, something that happened frequently in complex cases lacking evidence. All they saw before them was a disappearance with no foothold to continue. In the final meeting before the file was closed, the sheriff said a sentence that captured the spirit of that era perfectly. If any new leads come in, we'll reopen it. But until then, this case can't move forward. The weary meeting attendees stood up, gathered their notes. Outside, Yazoo City remained peaceful as any other day, and no one knew that in the county archives themselves, a thin file was about to lie dormant for decades, waiting for a tiny key that no one could have foreseen. And so, the disappearance of Rachel Dwyer officially entered a state of silence. No noise, no news, no new leads, only a thin file, a few incomplete notes, and a dark night in 1969 that the small town would never forget. 10 years passed since the night Rachel vanished. Yazoo City changed somewhat. A few new stores sprang up, the dirt roads were widened, and the residential area west of the pine forest saw additional homes planned. But even as the town grew, one thing remained untouched in the county archives: the thin file labeled Rachel Dwyer, missing person report. Most residents had grown accustomed to that disappearance becoming part of the town's sad stories, like a shadow no one wanted to mention again. In 1979, the sheriff's office conducted a routine review of old files. This was an annual procedure applied to cases closed for more than 5 years, aimed at reorganizing documents, classifying files for long-term storage, and removing duplicates. A young officer named Jerry McConnell was assigned to reopen a series of old cases, including Rachel's. Jerry was new to the job, passionate about reviewing unsolved cases, and especially had a habit of checking every detail in each report thoroughly. When Jerry opened the file, the first thing that caught his attention was its strangely thin size, far too thin for a child disappearance case. There were fewer than 30 pages in total, including the initial report, a few field notes, 2 hand-drawn diagrams, and some administrative papers. This made Jerry curious, because from experience with other cases, missing child files were usually thicker due to numerous follow-up reports and updates, even when nothing was found. Jerry began examining each document one by one. Everything seemed normal, until he turned to the section on witness statements. The report was paginated from 1 to 6, but between pages 3 and 4, there was a gap. The 2 pages did not connect in content. The statement on page 3 ended abruptly, but page 4 started with a completely different section, as if a linking page was missing. He checked the file's spine, no signs of unstapling or tearing, no rips, no old glue marks. It seemed as though nothing had ever been between pages 3 and 4, but the content was clearly discontinuous. Jerry marked this point, and continued reviewing the other documents. In the night duty officer report section, there was a signature from the recorder. But what bothered Jerry was that this signature did not match the other signatures from the same officer in files he had reviewed earlier. The strokes were thinner, less slanted, and the final flourish was completely different. A veteran officer might change their signature over many years, but this report was written in the same month as the others Jerry compared. To be sure, he pulled 2 more files from 1969, by the same officer. The signatures were clearly bold, decisive, and did not match the one in Rachel's file at all. It could not be coincidence. Jerry marked the second anomaly, signature suspected not matching original sample. Continuing the review, he discovered another strange point. In the evidence list section, there was a note about one child's item collected, but the description was extremely brief, just a few words, and more importantly, this page had no confirmation signature from the evidence collector. By the regulations of that year, every piece of evidence had to be signed for, stamped, and timed. But this page was completely blank, except for the handwriting. Another hastily penciled note was clipped at the end of the file, evidence item 1 transferred to property storage. But this line also lacked a signature. Another absurdity. Jerry searched the evidence storage, no sign of evidence item 1 from Rachel's case. No hairbow, no storage box, no numbered entry. It had all vanished. An older officer in the county, when asked by Jerry, just shrugged. Things were chaotic back then. Lost paperwork was common. Don't make too much of it. But Jerry didn't buy that. The disconnected pages, mismatched signature, missing evidence, it couldn't all be just mistakes. He continued to the file access log section. By regulation, every time the file was opened, the viewer had to sign. But this list had bizarre irregularities: a name of an officer who retired in 1975, but whose signature appeared in the 1977 entry, a signature entry with no name, just the signature, and especially, two entries written in much darker ink than the others, indicating they were added later, but without clear dates. Jerry began connecting all the data points: a missing page in the file, vanished evidence, incorrect signature, and an access log showing signs of tampering. This was enough for him to suspect that Rachel's file wasn't just poorly organized, it had been interfered with. Someone had once tried to edit, replace, or remove key information. He immediately drafted an internal report to the sheriff, detailing each anomaly, with photos of the signatures and loose pages attached. When the sheriff reviewed the documents, he was silent for a long time. The irregularities Jerry pointed out could not be ignored, but what puzzled him was who would have motive to interfere with a child disappearance case that had no leads, and why. To answer that question, he instructed Jerry to compile a list of everyone who had access to the file over the past 10 years. The list included 11 names: the night duty officer, record storage staff, 2 previous sheriffs, and a clerk who had moved to another state. Some on the list no longer lived in the area. A few were no longer in the profession, but 3 names were specially flagged for interviews: a former officer who managed the records room in 1969, the person with the ambiguous signature on the list, and an individual who accessed the file in 1977, despite theoretically not being on duty at that time. Rachel's file, thought to have sunk into oblivion, suddenly became a set of documents bearing signs of irregularity. There were no new leads about Rachel herself, but clearly something opaque had happened to the case file itself. And that discovery was the reason the seemingly buried case opened a new chapter, not because new evidence about Rachel was found, but because a secret hidden for years had unexpectedly come to light. While Jerry continued tracking down the list of people who had accessed the file, an unexpected coincidence emerged from a place no one anticipated: the Yazoo County Old Newspaper Archives. The Records Department was reorganizing local and state newspapers from the 1970s in preparation for transferring them to microfilm storage. A young employee, while flipping through the pages of a 1971 Jackson Daily News, suddenly spotted a small Polaroid photo clipped between 2 yellowed pages. It didn't belong to the newspaper, had no caption, no writing on the back, just a photo someone had apparently forgotten. The employee sent the picture to the sheriff's office because it showed a little girl standing in a crowd at an outdoor festival, and what caught his attention was, the girl looked very much like Rachel Dwyer. When Jerry received the Polaroid, he glanced at it briefly and immediately felt something strange. The photo captured a colorful festival in Jackson. Strings of flags stretched across the street, people crowded along temporary barricades, food stalls set up under white umbrellas. In the middle of the scene was a girl around 7 to 9 years old, with long light brown hair, standing close to the legs of a woman in light-colored clothing. Though the photo had faded, the girl's image was clear enough to notice facial features quite similar to Rachel's in 1969: round cheeks, large eyes, and a slightly timid stance. The first thing Jerry did was enlarge every corner of the Polaroid, using a photo viewer. He noticed the trees in the background, a row of oaks lining the street, a distinctive feature of downtown Jackson. At the bottom corner of the photo was a metal trash can marked Jackson Festival 71. Thus the time and place were almost certain: the Jackson Festival in 1971, just about 2 years after Rachel's disappearance. Jerry decided to verify the setting by comparing it to archived photos of that year's festival. He went to the Jackson Records office and requested images from the Summer Fair 1971 event. Several archived photos matched the exact street corners in the Polaroid: the stalls on the right, the 2-way walkway, and the decorative signs. He particularly found one wider angle shot that showed the area where the girl was standing was on the eastern row of the market square. This confirmed the Polaroid was not fake or manipulated, but genuinely taken at that festival. But what troubled Jerry most wasn't the girl. It was the woman standing beside her. The woman's face was obscured by the angle, Only half her body was visible, light-colored clothing, slightly shiny, possibly cotton or polyester, left hand placed on the girl's shoulder, right hand holding a small bag. There were no identifiable features, but her posture, slightly bent down, arm resting loosely on the shoulder, matched the description given by the Meridian bus station employee. The hand-on-shoulder gesture didn't feel like mother and child. Jerry showed the photo to an expert on facial expressions and body language in the department. The expert examined it closely and commented, "This doesn't look like a family member's gesture. It's too light, too detached. Hand on the shoulder but not wrapping around it, like someone trying to appear familiar but not naturally." This immediately connected in Jerry's mind to the bus station account, a woman in light clothing with a little girl, but strange gesture. Even if the girl in the photo might not be Rachel, the coincidence in the woman's appearance created an eerie unease. To check the possibility of random coincidence, Jerry analyzed the girl's position in the photo. The girl was basically standing near the temporary barricade, not in the children's play area, which seemed odd overall. She held no balloon or food in her hands, things most children at the festival carried. Her stance was somewhat stiff, hands at her sides, no sign of excitement. Those small details, viewed individually, weren't abnormal, but together they gave the impression the girl didn't blend into the festival like the other children. Jerry began contacting people who had helped organize the 1971 festival to determine who might have taken the Polaroid. An elderly employee of the Jackson City Fair said they had distributed some Polaroid cameras to volunteers that year to capture event moments, meaning the photo could have been taken by anyone attending, making tracing its origin nearly impossible. However, he confirmed the area in the photo was definitely the eastern corner, near the ball shooting games. Jerry examined the photo's border closely. Some Polaroids from 1970, 1972, had small markings on the back indicating film type. This one was a common type from 1971, further confirming the timing. One other thing made Jerry pause and think. The girl's height matched what Rachel's would have been at that age, assuming she had remained healthy and grown normally. At a quick glance, it could fool someone into thinking it was Rachel, but when enlarged, he saw the facial bone structure was slightly different, broader forehead, pointer chin. This was very likely a completely unrelated girl, but the strangeness still lay with the woman beside her, whose identity remained entirely unknown up to that point. When Jerry placed the photo on the analysis table alongside the other documents, one question became clear. Why was this Polaroid in an old Yazoo newspaper instead of in Jackson's archives? Who put it there, and for what purpose? No one in the county office had an answer. The records employee said they had never seen the photo before. The photo showed no signs of frequent handling, the edges weren't worn, the colors hadn't faded from light exposure. It was as if it had been clipped into the newspaper years ago, and then forgotten, untouched by anyone. Jerry marked the Polaroid as secondary evidence, value undetermined, but he felt this photo was not random. A girl resembling Rachel appearing 2 years after the disappearance, even if not Rachel, still made the event noteworthy. A woman in light clothing standing beside her, face hidden, identity unknown, made it even more so. He gathered everything, attached the photo to the end of Rachel's file, with a note. Photo does not match identity, but shows behavioral signs warranting review. Adult subject unverified. This was the first time in many years that Rachel's file gained a new detail, still vague, but enough to make anyone reading it pause and think longer than usual. And from the moment that Polaroid was added to the file, the Rachel Dwyer case, thought to have sunk into obscurity, began to gain an additional layer of mystery no one had anticipated. In the early 1980s, Mississippi began implementing a statewide campaign to review civil records in order to standardize data on births, adoptions, and identity changes. This was a period when the government wanted to transfer some paper records to microfilm, forcing counties to re-examine every old file for completeness. The news reached the Yazoo Sheriff's Office, and with Rachel's file still sitting quietly in the cold case cabinet, Jerry, now an official investigator, decided to seize the opportunity. He had read Rachel's file many times and remained haunted by the missing pages, mismatched signatures, and vanished evidence. When he heard that the State Department of Justice was recollecting adoption records from 1968, 1972, a thought flashed through his mind. If Rachel had been taken by an outsider, could her identity have been altered through an unclean adoption? Though the possibility was slim, oversight of adoptions in that era was very lax, and there were many cases involving altered records without DNA cross-verification. Jerry went to the Mississippi Vital Records office in Jackson and requested access to the batch of adoption records from 1968 to 1972. The employee in charge, a woman around 50, knowledgeable about procedures from that time, handed him a series of thick-bound volumes, each hundreds of pages long. She said bluntly, "Back then, a lot of paperwork was filled out by hand, with little cross-verification. Messiness was normal." But what Jerry wanted wasn't random files. He was looking for any records showing signs of manual alterations, as those could be traces of an effort to change an identity. He set up criteria: records with erasure marks, or overwriting, signatures not matching the standard for that year, records listing a birth date, but lacking a matching birth certificate, full names of adoptive parents filled in but missing biological parent information, records processed in Meridian or nearby areas between 1969, 1971. In just 2 hours of reviewing, he found many records with minor irregularities, some birth declarations written in 2 different inks, some records listing a birth date but without a midwife's signature, some adoptions where the biological parents section was left blank without valid explanation. However, these still fell within administrative carelessness, not serious enough, until he opened a volume labeled Meridian, January 1970. As soon as he looked at the top half of the first page, Jerry froze. This was an adoption record for a little girl recorded as born in September 1969, less than a year after Rachel vanished. The girl was given a new surname, with no photo attached, but the anomaly lay in the certifying signature. The handwriting matched the mismatched signature Jerry had seen in Rachel's file. He immediately pulled out a photocopy of the signature from Rachel's file for comparison. Though faded over time, the final flourish and slant were identical. No mistake. The same person had signed both Rachel's file and this adoption record, but the issue was, the signer was listed as the 1969 night duty officer, while this adoption was signed on January 11, 1970. A time when he no longer had responsibility for certifying civil records. Jerry felt a chill down his spine. This wasn't paperwork coincidence, this was a sign of interference. He continued examining the edits. The line for former birth name was blurred out with ink, with a new name written over it in the same color but bolder strokes. The birth date remained unchanged, a date that didn't match any hospital births in Meridian at that time. When Jerry asked the records employee about this file, she looked surprised. This is one of the files that was internally investigated in the late 1970s due to invalid signatures, but without clear evidence, it was dropped. This made Jerry see the full extent of the irregularity. He requested the original file from cold storage, but the employee said, "The original has been missing for years. Only this copy remains, an adoption record with improper signature, manual edits, no original." It couldn't just be administrative error. Jerry noted everything in his investigation log: record processed in Meridian, a location that had appeared in Rachel's case leads, timing, January 1970. Right after Rachel's file was initially closed, signature matching the anomalous one in Rachel's file, direct edits to the birth name, missing original birth certificate. At the end of the record were the adoptive parents' names, a couple living in the Meridian suburbs, but the address listed no longer existed, the house demolished in the 1980s. The contact phone number was also disconnected. However, what interested Jerry most was a small note at the bottom. The child was delivered to the adoptive family by a third party, with no identity recorded for the handover person. Third-party information was extremely rare in legal adoptions, as adoptions required verification from a social agency or hospital. He asked the records employee, in that era, Was it ever allowed for a third-party individual to personally deliver the child? The supervisor answered firmly, not permitted, but many files were completed later with mismatched signatures. We once suspected an unofficial adoption ring in Meridian, but lacked evidence. That statement made Jerry take it more seriously. An unofficial adoption ring, if it existed, it fit terrifyingly well with what happened in Rachel's case. Tampered file, missing evidence, wrong signatures, and now an irregular adoption record right in Meridian. He continued reviewing a few more files from that period. 10 records showed signs of editing, but only one bore the signature pattern matching the anomaly in Rachel's file, and that one involved a nameless little girl given a new name just months after Rachel vanished. Jerry knew one coincidence alone wasn't enough to prove anything, but his instinct told him this wasn't random. The signs, one by one, were drifting toward the same point, Meridian. As he closed the thick volume, he wrote a single line at the top of his suspect list: adoption record, Meridian 1970. Verify signer, submitter and handover person. Contact everyone on the old file access list. Though he didn't know where this would lead, it was the first time in nearly 12 years that a document appeared not just irregular, but bearing signs of deliberate interference. And that was the piece capable of shifting the entire direction of an investigation long thought asleep. In the early 1980s, as Jerry was aggressively tracking down irregular adoption records in Meridian, an unexpected piece of information emerged from the place he least expected. A middle-aged man living in the suburbs of Yazoo City requested a private meeting with the police to talk about something from many years ago. The man's name was Roy Calhoun, then over 50, with silver hair mixed with ash-gray strands. He entered the room with a hesitant demeanor, standing for a long time before sitting down as if engaged in a fierce internal struggle. When Jerry asked why he was there, Roy simply replied, "It's time to speak up." Roy recounted that on the night Rachel disappeared, he was driving on the dirt road behind the pine forest row to get home after an overtime shift at the mill. It was a route few people took, especially at night. As his car approached the wide curve leading to the main road, he spotted another vehicle parked close to the roadside, with faint taillights reflecting through the mist. The first thing that caught his attention was that the car was parked too close to the forest edge, as if trying to avoid being seen from the main road. He said, his voice trembling slightly as he recalled, "I didn't think anything of it at the time, but when I slowed down because of the bumpy road, I saw someone bending down next to the back door of the car. There was a sound, like a child crying or choking." Jerry wrote down every word. Roy said he had seen a small arm sticking out from the back door in the brief moment when his headlights swept over. An adult, he couldn't tell if male or female, had quickly pulled the child's arm back inside and slammed the door shut. Jerry asked why he hadn't reported it to the police. Roy was silent for a long time before saying, his voice full of remorse, "I was scared back then. I had a minor record from my youth, didn't want to get involved. I didn't know it was something that serious." That was why he had stayed silent for over a decade. Jerry asked Roy to describe the car in as much detail as possible. Roy remembered it was a dark-colored car, possibly dark green or black, mid-sized sedan from the 1960s. There was a long paint scratch near the rear window. This detail involuntarily reminded Jerry of the description of the strange car that appeared at the grocery store in the early investigation days, also dark-colored, also with a paint scratch in the back. Though that man had been ruled out as a suspect due to timing mismatch, the car had a suspiciously matching feature. Jerry pulled out the 1969 topographic map and asked Roy to point out the location where he saw the car. Roy circled a spot, the dirt road west of the pine forest, which the police had marked as one of 3 possible routes to leave the Dwyer house area without being seen. When Jerry compared the direction Roy indicated with the 1969 diagram, he quickly realized this was the third direction, the one rated least likely in the initial investigation phase, due to few impressions, but ideal for a car to drive through. This made Jerry sit up straight, because from the start of the case, Rachel's disappearance had always been analyzed in 3 possibilities: the child leaving on her own, a stranger leading her via the near forest path, or being taken to a vehicle and leaving the area. The taken to a vehicle direction had no specific evidence beyond a few indistinct tire marks. Now Roy's testimony, though late, matched that direction perfectly. Jerry continued asking, "Did you see the license plate?" Roy shook his head. "No, too dark. I just remember the plate had a faint reflective glow, and it wasn't a Yazoo County plate. Just my guess." Though just a guess, the detail of the plate not being Yazoo's matched the hypothesis that the perpetrator wasn't a local. Roy continued describing the adult figure he glimpsed, average height, wearing light-colored clothing, slightly long arms, hurried movements when pulling the child in. Two things caught Jerry's attention. First, the average build was too generic to identify. But second, light-colored clothing hit exactly on a detail that had appeared in multiple prior anomalies. The Meridian bus station employee described a woman in light clothing. In the Jackson Festival Polaroid, the woman next to the girl was also in light clothing. This could only be coincidence, or a chain of behavior linked to the same person. Jerry pressed Roy for details on the direction the car left. Roy said as soon as it saw his headlights, the other car turned on its high beams and drove south, the direction leading away from Yazoo City toward the road to Meridian. When Jerry heard the word Meridian, his suspicion tightened like a vice. It was impossible to ignore this coincidence: the irregular adoption record in Meridian, the Polaroid photo containing the strange woman at the Jackson Festival, and now a late witness testimony, showing the suspicious car leaving town in the exact direction of Meridian. Jerry flipped back to the old map. The road Roy described was indeed the shortest way to leave Yazoo City without passing the center, ideal for someone wanting to avoid attention. It intersected the inter-county dirt road, then connected to Highway 49, the route running straight to Meridian. Roy paused for a moment, then said, "I know I might have done wrong by not speaking up sooner. Every time the disappearance was mentioned, I felt guilty. But back then I really didn't understand what I saw." Jerry sensed that sincerity couldn't be dismissed. He asked Roy to sign the late witness statement record, and Roy agreed immediately, as if finally unburdening a weight after many years. As Roy left the room, Jerry looked back at the investigation board in front of him. A story thought to have fallen into silence for years suddenly had a new link. Roy's testimony not only confirmed a child being put into a car, but tied it to one of the three initial directions, the one that had been rated lowest, and more importantly, it pulled all the scattered details onto the same axis: the dark-colored car, the adult in light clothing, and the direction heading toward Meridian. That feeling, when scattered fragments suddenly formed a hazy but directed line, made Jerry understand that Rachel's file had never truly been cold. It was just waiting for the right moment to open itself. In 2018, Mississippi, along with many other states, began collaborating with commercial genetic analysis companies like Family Tree DNA, GED Match, and MyHeritage to help solve historical cold cases. When this information reached the Yazoo Sheriff's Office, Rachel's file was re-examined by a long-standing state cold case review team. The experts decided to try an approach that was impossible in previous eras: submitting DNA samples from the Dwyer family into genealogical databases to determine if anyone nationwide showed signs of close blood relation to the family. The Dwyer family, though more than half a century had passed, still had a few siblings of Mr. Dwyer living near Yazoo, along with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Investigators collected DNA samples from a granddaughter and a grandson, both considered direct line representatives of the Dwyer bloodline. Since there was no DNA from Rachel herself, police used proxy genetic tracing, indirect tracing through blood relatives, a technique that had produced many breakthroughs across the U.S. in recent years. The DNA samples were uploaded to a broad linked database containing millions of people who had submitted their DNA for genealogical purposes. By procedure, the system needed a few weeks to run matches, but just over 3 weeks later, the cold case team received an automated email from the system: "Close family match detected." The similarity level was in the 22%, 25% range. This was not the level of distant relatives, but the level of a biological child, niece, nephew, or half-siblings. Police immediately opened the match file. The name that appeared on the screen, Anna Hartwell, 49 years old, living in Tennessee, just over a 3-hour drive from Mississippi. Jerry, now retired but invited as a consultant for the review project, sat in front of the screen and felt a chill down his spine. For 50 years, there had been no sign whatsoever that Rachel was still alive. But this match level was absolutely not random. Anna Hartwell had a very close blood relation to the Dwyer family. Upon deeper analysis, the algorithm determined that Anna could be the daughter of Rachel's sibling. Impossible, since Rachel was only 7 when she vanished. The biological child of Rachel even less biologically feasible at that time, or almost certainly, Rachel herself, after having her identity changed. Though the system could not confirm it absolutely, the match level was so high that the investigation team immediately opened an official 2018 re-examination file under the name Case 69, RD, Potential Identity Confirmation, Match Anna Hartwell. Investigators began gathering public information on Anna. Civil records showed she was born in 1969, but the date listed in the paperwork matched a time frame not belonging to any recorded birth according to original Mississippi hospital records from that year. This was the type of fabricated birth date commonly seen in unofficial adoption records from that era. Anna grew up in Meridian, exactly the location that had appeared multiple times in prior suspicions, the late witness Roy's statement about the car's direction, the 1970 adoption record with the improper signature, the bus route where a child was once reported sighted, and now a DNA match pointing almost directly to that city as a transfer point. The investigation team requested a cross-check of Anna Hartwell's birth record. When the file was sent back from the Vital Records office, the first thing they saw was the biological parents section completely blank, the child handover field replaced with unidentified third party, and the certifying signature looked as suspiciously familiar. Jerry held 2 files, one a photocopy from the 1970 adoption record he had examined during the 1980s review, and Anna Hartwell's record. The verification signature at the bottom of the page, with its slanted strokes and elongated final flourish, identical. The same person had signed both records, but that person had no authority to certify adoptions. Police requested an additional public DNA sample from Anna via the genealogy database by regulation, requiring user consent or a special warrant. Since Anna had voluntarily uploaded her DNA to explore her origins, using the profile within a genealogical investigation was legal, the genetic analysis team confirmed the match level with the Dwyer line could not be distant relatives. No adoptive parents' DNA samples in Anna's file for comparison, and the similarity trended toward direct lineage, suggesting Anna was not legally adopted, but a child whose identity was changed through altered birth records. When reviewing Anna's school records, another interesting detail emerged. Anna had lived at 3 different addresses in the Meridian area during her first 10 years, an unusual pattern for a legally adopted child. These school transfers occurred right around the time state-level internal investigations into adoption records were launched, as if the adoptive family was moving to avoid scrutiny. The investigation team began comparing Anna's first move in 1973 with the times police had received multiple false tips about a child resembling Rachel appearing. The timelines matched eerily. Genealogical experts continued analyzing the match. They determined Anna shared approximately 1,600, 1,900 cm of DNA with Dwyer family members. This is the level of full siblings, parent-child or direct line adoption. Since Rachel disappeared in 1969 without leaving children, and had biological siblings with DNA for comparison, this level almost confirmed that Anna Hartwell was Rachel Dwyer, or had a direct blood relation close enough that no other possibility fit better. Police presented the results to the state prosecutor's office. Immediately a new file was opened under Code RD 28 TNA plus Identity Review Case. The official investigative directions were clearly recorded. 1. Cross-check Anna Hartwell's identity against original civil data. 2. Interview the adoptive parents, if still alive. 3. Trace the person who signed the 1970 adoption record. 4. Connect the event's car direction toward Meridian, altered records, Polaroid of the woman in light clothing, matching bloodline DNA. When reading the entire report again, a veteran officer on the team said just one sentence: "We're not just about to confirm Anna's identity, we're touching a network that has hidden everything for 50 years. And that was the first time in nearly half a century that the name Rachel Dwyer was linked to a living person, a person with flesh and blood, records, and a separate life. A period at the end of a page, but one that marked the beginning of the biggest turning point in the case since 1969. Immediately after the RD 2018 file was reopened, the investigation team focused on reconstructing Anna Hartwell's entire biography from infancy to the present. Genetic identity verification was only the first step to make each piece reveal the full picture. They needed to cross-check all of Anna's civil, medical, and educational records against actual timelines. This was the only way to determine whether her past had been fabricated or concealed by someone within the system. The team started with elementary school records, as these were the documents least likely to be forged in the 1970s, 1980s. They contacted the 3 elementary schools listed in the records, where Anna had attended, the first in Meridian Kindergarten, another in Clark County grades 1-2, and the third where she completed grade 5. At the first school, the attendance ledger showed Anna only appearing starting in the 1974 school year, when she was about 5 years old, meaning she had no records before kindergarten, and more importantly, no paperwork confirming participation in the mandatory health program for new enrollees. At that time, Mississippi required vaccination certification and basic health checks for kindergarten entry, but Anna's file contained only a thin sheet noting documents submitted late, temporary approval, no doctor's signature, no medical facility name, no specific date. This was extremely unusual. When contacting the second elementary school where Anna attended grade 1, the team received a thicker file, but one detail made them pause for quite a while. In the place of birth section, Anna was listed as Meridian General Hospital, a hospital the team had already checked and confirmed had no birth records matching Anna's name or the date on her birth certificate. This further reinforced the suspicion that her birth certificate had been recreated or copied from an improper template. Next, the investigation team went to the third school where Anna attended grades 3 through 5. There they met a retired teacher who still had a very good memory of the late 1970s. She said right away when asked Anna was a quiet and well-behaved child, but there was always a feeling like she didn't fully know who she was. When pressed further, she explained, when the other kids talked about their families, Anna would often stay silent. She never talked about when she was younger. I used to think it was because of being adopted, but looking back now, it was strange. She always avoided answering questions about anything before age 5. The investigation team began noting this as a significant information gap from her birth in 1969 to around 1973, 1974. There was no clear trace of Anna, no medical records, no vaccination history, no evidence of routine checkups, and no proof she had ever been cared for at any legitimate medical facility. Next, the team turned to Anna's birth certificate. Though the 1970 copy had long been suspected, they needed to analyze every detail closely. The certificate listed the adoptive parents as Hartwell in clear handwriting, but in the section for changing biological parents' names, the forensic imaging team noticed faint erasure marks from rubbing, an old technique often used when record keepers wanted to remove old information from the original paper rather than issue a new one. In that era, many social workers in unofficial adoptions did this to avoid legal complications. In the date of issue section, the team spotted another hole. The date did not match any late birth registration dates in the system, a sign the paperwork was issued specially, bypassing standard procedures. When examining Anna's medical records, the gaps continued to appear. In the family doctor's file for the Hartwells who had retired and transferred the practice, the team found brief entries about Anna's checkups from 1975, 1978. But in the notes, Dr. Hartwell had written, "Initial visit unable to verify prior medical history. Child arrived with no vaccination records." The medical forensics team marked this note in red, "Medical gap for first 4 years of life, severely abnormal, To strengthen the hypothesis, they compared it to records of legally adopted children from that era. No cases lacked complete vaccination traces, yet Anna had no data on any shots until age 5. These gaps could not appear accidentally. They aligned with the suspicions about the irregular adoption record Jerry had uncovered in the 1980s. A child delivered by a third party, not through a hospital, not through a social agency, without a proper birth certificate. The investigation team continued tracing childhood items stored in the Hartwell family attic. Mrs. Hartwell had passed away in 2005, but her daughter, Anna's adoptive sister, still kept some mementos. When the team met her, she brought out an old wooden box containing a few items Anna had played with as a young child. One item in it left the investigation team frozen: a light blue hair bow with white polka dots, edges slightly frayed, sized for a child aged 5 to 8. No one on the team spoke for several seconds. The image of the first bow found in 1969, evidence item 1 that had gone missing, flashed in their minds. The color, size, even the pattern were almost identical to the original description in Rachel's missing person file. When asked about the bow's origin, the adoptive sister said, "I don't know exactly. My mother said Anna had it from the time she was brought home. I remember Anna really liked this bow, but Mom always said it was old, not something she bought." That detail sent a jolt through the entire investigation team, because the bow found in the woods in 1969, the most critical evidence, had vanished from the property log after the file was tampered with. The fact that an almost identical bow was among Anna's childhood belongings could not be coincidence. That item was the first tangible link between Rachel in 1969 and Anna in the 1970s. The forensics team conducted fabric analysis to determine if the fiber type, dye and pattern belonged to the same production era. Preliminary results showed the Hartwell bow's fabric matched types produced in the late 1960s, common in rural Mississippi general stores. Statistical samples indicated many stores sold this pattern, but the key point was, the Dwyer family had described Rachel wearing a light blue polka dot bow on the exact day she vanished. When the analysis combining DNA, medical records, educational records, childhood evidence was laid out side by side, a larger picture emerged. Anna did not just have a DNA match with the Dwyers. Anna also carried physical traces, forged records, and timeline gaps consistent with a scenario of identity change as a young child. What had once been suspicions now formed a system: altered files, changed identity, concealed past, and the bow, a small item in a memory box, became the most authentic piece connecting two lives that seemed separate. Anna's biography, instead of answering questions, only thickened the mystery. If Anna was Rachel, who took her, who changed her identity, and why create an entirely new life for her in the shadows? Those questions were leading the investigation to a deeper layer, the layer of the record manipulators, the woman in light clothing, and the car that sped into the night in 1969. The analysis of Anna's biography and childhood evidence was enough to convince the investigation team that they were getting very close to the truth. But in modern investigations, especially for missing persons cases spanning half a century, no evidence is considered final until direct DNA testing is performed. The genetic experts, after analyzing the genealogical match, confirmed that Anna's unusually high similarity with the Dwyer lineage was almost certainly a direct blood relation. However, legal procedure required a direct kinship test between Anna and Dwyer family members. Anna Hartwell was contacted through her attorney to ensure her privacy. When informed that she might be the victim missing since 1969, Anna was completely stunned. She told the investigation team that her entire life had unexplained gaps. "I always felt like I didn't truly belong where I grew up, but I never thought my identity could have been changed." After a few days of reflection and family consultation, Anna agreed to participate in a direct forensic standard DNA test. The sampling session took place at the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation's DNA laboratory. Anna's DNA was collected using the standard method buccal swab. At the same time, two direct relatives of Rachel, a female cousin and a male cousin on the paternal side, were also sampled for direct comparison using autosomal DNA modeling. This was the method that had produced turning points in hundreds of cold cases across the United States. The testing went through 3 phases. 1. Allele matching between Anna and the Dwyers. 2. Calculation of gene repeat overlap at key markers. 3. Establishment of the coefficient of relatedness. In the first week, preliminary results from the STR short tandem repeat analysis software prompted the forensics team to call the investigators immediately. The gene match level exceeded 50% at many key markers, something that only occurs between full siblings, parent-child, or 2 individuals who are the same person with an altered identity. Since Rachel disappeared at age 7 and could not have had children, this result immediately narrowed the possibilities. Anna was very likely Rachel herself, but the forensics team continued comprehensive verification. By the end of the second week, the official report, nearly 40 pages thick, was sent to the investigation office. The first line stated clearly, "Genetic conclusion, Anna Hartwell shares direct biological kinship with the Dwyer family, consistent with a first-degree relative. Probability of identity match is 99.998%. When Jerry, though retired but invited to the meeting room, held that report in his hands, he felt the moment he had waited for decades had finally arrived. The genetic experts presented, matching 2426 STR markers, rare haplogroup similarity of the Dwyer line, kinship coefficient index that virtually eliminated any chance Anna was not Rachel, probability of 2 unrelated people matching at this level, less than 1 in 100 million. The legal conclusion was recorded clearly. DNA evidence confirms that Anna Hartwell is Rachel Dwyer. No one in the room spoke for several seconds. A disappearance case closed in 1969, dormant in the file cabinet for nearly 50 years, had been resolved using technology no one at the time could have imagined. But confirming the identity was only the beginning. It did not answer the most critical question: who took Rachel, and why was she separated from her family, renamed, and raised in Meridian with a completely new identity? Immediately after the results were confirmed, the file was transferred directly to the Mississippi Cold Case Task Force, a unit specializing in re-investigating old cases involving identity changes, child abductions, and altered records. The transfer report had 3 main points. 1. The identity of Rachel Dwyer has been confirmed. The child missing in 1969 did not die, but was taken to Meridian under the identity Anna Hartwell. 2. Suspected interference with records in 1970, involving a signer without proper authority. 3. Indications of criminal conduct, child abduction, document alteration, identity concealment, and possible collusion within the administrative system of that era. When the file was transferred to the task force, a special meeting was convened. Forensic experts, genealogical specialists, civil records experts, and representatives from the state prosecutor's office all attended. Everyone understood that the next step was no longer searching for a missing little girl, but pursuing the individuals who had hidden a child for over 50 years. In the meeting minutes, a genealogical expert said, "The DNA test has resolved the little girl, but the person who took her is still out there, and the one who signed the 1970 record created an illegal adoption that needs to be clarified." With DNA confirming Anna was Rachel, the case file was reclassified to the task force's highest priority level. From a seemingly impossible disappearance, it became a decades-long abduction, identity alteration, concealment case, with traces scattered from 1969 to the recent irregular documents discovered. A new chapter began, the chapter pursuing those behind Rachel's disappearance, the ones who made an entire town believe a 7-year-old girl had vanished without a trace, while the truth was that she had lived right in Mississippi, within reach, under a different name, for more than half a century. The DNA confirmation shifted Rachel's case file into an entirely new phase. At this point, the goal was no longer searching for a missing little girl, but tracing those who took Rachel from Yazoo City in 1969 and created the identity Anna Hartwell. Starting with the life journey of the Hartwell couple in Meridian, the Cold Case Task Force began reconstructing their full timeline from 1968, 1980, the critical period of the case. Civil records showed Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, Paul and Marjorie Hartwell, moved to Meridian in late 1968, just months before Rachel vanished. This was a detail no one had noticed before, but when placed in the new timeline, it became particularly significant. Before Meridian, they lived in Atala County, where Mr. Hartwell worked as a mechanic, and Mrs. Hartwell was a sales clerk at a general store. Their move from Atala to Meridian was noted in tax records as a job change, but without specific reasons. One notable point was that their 1968 tax records showed fairly low income, insufficient to qualify for adoption through official channels, making the 1970 adoption record even more suspicious. Investigators asked who facilitated their ability to adopt a child without valid birth documentation, who guaranteed it. The team began examining the Hartwells' social connections from that era. They discovered Mr. Hartwell had worked at a small garage in Meridian, owned by the brother of a former Yazoo City officer, who left the force in late 1971. This former officer was named Eldon Price, one of those on duty during the initial phase of Rachel's case. In the file access list Jerry had found in the 1980s, there was an ambiguous signature without a name, matching the improper signature in both Rachel's file and the 1970 adoption record. When comparing Price's signature samples from his service period, the forensics team noted the slant and letter flourishes were quite similar, though not identical. However, the issue was, Price was on duty the night Rachel disappeared, and just months after the Hartwells moved to Meridian, Price suddenly resigned, leaving the force citing family issues. These details, once scattered, now began fitting together like pieces of the same puzzle. The Cold Case Task Force decided to trace the Hartwells' life path in the first 10 years after adopting Anna. Their tracking map showed 1970, 1973, lived at the first house in the Meridian suburbs, where a former landlord described frequent visitors, but they never came inside. 1973, 1978, moved to a second house near an old hospital, around the time Anna started kindergarten. 1978, 1981, moved a third time, right after the state launched an internal investigation into invalid adoption records. Their frequent moves led the investigation team to believe they were trying to avoid detection. When questioning neighbors from the old Hartwell homes, some recalled occasionally a man in an old police uniform visiting in the evenings. When shown a photo of former officer Eldon Price, an elderly witness nodded, "Looks a lot like him. I think he came a few times." This prompted the task force to verify the relationship between Price and the Hartwells. In old employment records, it was noted that Mr. Hartwell had briefly worked at Price's brother's garage. Repair invoices from the 1970s showed Price had brought his car there multiple times. This connection was not coincidental. The investigation team hypothesized Price, with his authority at the time, had helped the Hartwells adopt Rachel unofficially, giving the green light for a fake birth registration and concealing the records. To strengthen this, they examined Rachel's birth registration file. The 1970 form contained an invalid signature and a third-party delivery entry. When comparing this to Price's records in the Yazoo archives, the forensics team discovered a chilling detail. The form number used for the birth certificate matched a batch of forms Price had controlled while working at the Yazoo County office. This meant someone with access to Yazoo County's administrative forms in 1969, 1970. That person used an official form from the batch to create a new birth certificate for Anna, and the certifying signature was written in a style that had appeared in Price's records. At this point, the task force had to ask, was Price the one who directly brought Rachel to Meridian, or was he just the facilitator through record alteration? The team delved deeper into the Hartwell family background. Social history showed Paul Hartwell had serious financial debt in the late 1960s. Local court file rumors indicated he had done odd jobs for some in law enforcement in exchange for clearing old debts, but no direct evidence. The investigation team interviewed Mrs. Hartwell's relatives, her sister living in Jackson. When asked about Mrs. Hartwell adopting Anna in 1970, She said, "I always believed my sister didn't want to do anything wrong. She was very kind. But she once said the child was brought as a gift, and they were told not to ask questions." That statement became the key phrase of the entire file. Brought as a gift, not to ask questions. This matched the pattern in illegal adoptions of that era. Children given to childless couples with the promise of no paperwork needed, in exchange for silence. And the intermediaries were often social workers or officers with record access. The deeper the task force investigated, the more Price's interference in the 1970 birth record appeared non-coincidental. He was on the Rachel file access list, had potential access to Yazoo forms, had a connection to the garage where Hartwell worked, and was seen visiting the Hartwells in the early 1970s. After analyzing all data related to the Hartwells and Price, the task force compiled a list of individuals potentially directly involved in creating Anna's fake birth certificate. 1. Eldon Price, former Yazoo officer, on night duty in 1969. 2. The Meridian garage owner, Price's brother, connecting Hartwell to Price. 3. Paul Hartwell, Anna's adoptive father with signs of financial debt and involvement in an intermediary network. 4. The woman in light-colored clothing, unidentified, but repeatedly appearing in the Jackson Festival Polaroid and witness statements. 5. A 1970 Civil Records Office employee, presumed to have legalized the birth certificate. Each piece, the car heading to Meridian, altered adoption records, matching signatures, childhood items, late witness, now connected into a clear shape, a small network operating in the shadows, linking Yazoo and Meridian in the late 1960s, likely deceivingly removing a child from her real family and cleaning her identity with fake paperwork. But to conclude definitively, the task force knew they needed to return to the most critical clue, the woman in light-colored clothing, the mysterious figure who appeared multiple times but never showed her face. And from here the investigation began shifting toward tracing that woman's whereabouts, a link that could unlock the entire secret buried for over half a century. After narrowing down the group of individuals potentially involved in changing Rachel's identity, the Cold Case Task Force decided to re-examine the Hartwells' first old house in Meridian, the home where Anna lived from 1970-1973, before their first move. The house now belonged to a new owner, but upon being informed it was for a serious cold case investigation, the owner agreed to allow the search. The house looked ordinary from the outside. Old red brick walls, faded tile roof, a weathered front porch, but to the task force team, it was one of the locations most likely to hold answers for the erased from records period in Anna's early years. As soon as they entered, the forensics team began remeasuring the entire house dimensions based on the original 1967 blueprints obtained from building records. Here, an anomaly emerged quickly. The total area listed in the blueprints was about 30 square feet larger than the actual combined room sizes. This indicated a hidden or remodeled space after the house was built. A forensics member used a laser distance measure to check wall thickness and symmetry between rooms. In the narrow hallway leading to the back bedroom, the left wall was nearly twice as thick as the right, an abnormal sign in residential structures of that era. When lightly tapping the wall, the left side sounded hollower. One investigator whispered, "This isn't an original wall." They moved furniture away from the wall and scanned with a thermal camera. The screen image revealed a rectangular void between two wall layers, with stable temperature and no airflow, indicating it had been unused for decades. Just by looking, the task force knew they had touched a critical link. After obtaining a demolition warrant, they began prying the drywall at the suspicious spot. As the wall came off, an old wooden door frame, nailed shut from the outside, emerged like a scar from the past. An investigator gently pried the frame with a crowbar, and the concealed wooden door, hidden for over 40 years, opened with a dry, creaking sound. Inside was a small room only about 6 feet by 7 feet, lower than the main ceiling, with no windows, no ventilation. Flashlight beams swept through to reveal thick dust covering the floor. But the first thing that silenced the entire team was an old child's bed, its wooden frame rotted, but still recognizable as a style common in the late 1960s. In the corner, a pale pink children's blanket rolled up, along with a wooden toy, a hand-carved chicken, the type characteristic of small craft shops in Yazoo and Atala in the 1960s. A forensics member said quietly, "This is a northern Mississippi toy, not something made in Meridian." The team collected each item with tongs and placed them in specialized evidence bags, but what gave them chills the most was a pair of off-white children's shoes, sized for a girl around 6-7 years old, the exact age Rachel was when she vanished. The soles still had some dirt crumbs, and preliminary analysis showed the soil color and mineral composition more similar to Yazoo area dirt than Meridian's. The forensics team recorded everything in the report. Small room sealed from the outside. No signs of use after 1973. Items inside consistent with a child aged 5 to 7. Some toys not of local Meridian origin. Upon closer wall inspection, they found saw, cut, and nail marks from old hand tools, the type commonly used in the 1970s, before nail guns became widespread. The door frame wood was layered over older wood, with signs of structural changes after the house was built. This indicated the room was not part of the original design, but created by the owners at the time, the Hartwells. In the room was one more strange detail, a piece of light-colored fabric, perhaps once a sheet, draped over a wooden dowel nailed in place. The fabric had faded over time, but when light hit it, it reflected softly, recalling the image of the woman in light-colored clothing that had appeared in multiple clues. The Meridian bus station, the Jackson Festival Polaroid, and witness Roy's statement. One investigator whispered, "She was here." The final point the search team noted in the report was the wall remodeling signs. After analyzing paint layers and drywall samples, the team determined the room was sealed around 1975, matching the time the Hartwells moved to their second house and left the old one. This suggested the former owners wanted to erase all traces of the room, but did not demolish it completely, only blocking it off. A list was compiled immediately after the search. 1. Secret room created after the house was built. 2. Children's items from the period of Rachel's disappearance. 3. Toys not originating from Meridian. 4. Wall remodeling signs appearing when the Hartwells moved the first time. 5. Light-colored fabric, suggesting connection to the unidentified female figure. In the task force meeting room, all investigators agreed that this small room could not just be a storage space. It bore traces of a place where a child was briefly confined, or a temporary holding spot before identity change. The Hartwells had lived there exactly during the time Rachel disappeared from medical records in the adoption file, but the biggest question still lingered: who brought Rachel to this room? The Hartwells, Price, or the woman in light clothing? And more importantly, what was the room's role? Was it where Rachel was initially held, or a temporary place before being moved to the next house? The task force knew that searching the old house had only cracked open the door to the past, but that door led to a truth growing ever clearer. Rachel did not vanish due to a sudden accident. She was taken, hidden, and raised in the shadows of a small sealed room in the heart of Meridian. The discovery of the hidden room in Meridian forced the investigation team to reconstruct Rachel's entire journey, from the moment she vanished until she appeared in records under the name Anna Hartwell. This task required combining multiple scattered data sources: the late witness statement, 1969 road maps, old vehicle records, interstate traffic information, and minor details previously overlooked in archived documents. When pieced together, the fragments began forming a clear route. The starting point was the location where the dark-colored car was sighted by the witness on the night Rachel disappeared. The dirt road beside the forest then led straight to the only highway that could exit the area, without passing through the central residential zone. The road design of that era left only one viable direction, south, to merge onto Highway 49. The faint tire marks recorded in old files showed tread sizes compatible with 1960s sedans, further reinforcing the hypothesis that the trip began with a direct drive toward Jackson. In Jackson, archived data on illegal parking from the late 1960s was limited, but the investigation team found a report describing a dark-colored car parked unusually long in a lot next to the flea market area. The timing matched roughly a few hours after Rachel was last seen. This flea market area had a key feature at the time. It served as a trading hub, connecting routes for goods to Meridian, Baton Rouge, and Mobile. Stopping the car there allowed transferring people or vehicles without drawing attention, especially at night. From Jackson to Meridian, the most efficient route in 1969 was not the interstate, but Highway 80, which had many discrete stopping points. When cross-referencing the statement from a Newton gas station employee, who described a woman in light clothing with a small child, the investigation team marked the route right on Highway 80. The witness's description of the woman's hand-on-shoulder gesture matching prior accounts of an unnatural gesture created a suspicious link between events. Old vehicle registration records from those years provided a list of dark-colored sedans in the area. The list was short, and among the matching ones was a vehicle registered in Meridian to the brother of a former Yazoo officer. When placing this factor on the route map, the connections became clear: the car starting from Yazoo, brief stop in Jackson, then continuing to Meridian, all consistent with the vehicle profile the team was tracing. Once the car reached Meridian, Rachel's journey did not end. The house where she lived as a young child was found to have a secret room, and the dirt on the shoes inside matched Yazoo area soil more than Meridian's. To understand where Rachel was during the interrupted period, the investigation team reviewed transport logs from the garage where Hartwell worked. Old invoices showed the garage frequently repaired and rented vehicles for routes to Louisiana and Alabama in the early 1970s. Notably, these invoices recorded irregular trips, many without clear purpose. The route out of Mississippi via Louisiana at the time mainly followed Highway 80 or 49, then branched to secondary roads toward Baton Rouge. The investigation team identified a few remote stops along this route, where a child could be hidden undetected. An elderly woman in Baton Rouge recalled seeing a little girl with a woman in light-colored clothing at a rest stop in 1970. But since no matching disappearance case existed at the time, the information was filed as unverified. These fragments, when placed on the 1969-1973 map, created a multi-point journey. Rachel may have been taken out of Mississippi at least once, to avoid creating records in the state where the disappearance occurred. Taking a child across state lines and back was a common method in illegal adoptions of that era, to confuse tracing. Afterward, upon returning to Meridian, a fake birth certificate was created, assigning the child a new identity, Anna Hartwell. To understand each individual's responsibility, the investigation team analyzed the role of every person in the movement chain. The most powerful figure at the time was likely the car driver, highly probable a relative of the former officer mentioned, with the means and matching route. The woman in light-colored clothing appearing at multiple stops was the key factor. She seemed to be the one directly taking the child from Yazoo, influencing the child during handover, and present when the child appeared publicly in Jackson, Newton, or Baton Rouge. Her movement and appearances led the investigation team to believe she was the handler in the network. The Hartwell couple appeared to play the most stabilizing role. They were the final destination of the journey. Their house was remodeled to create a temporary child confinement space before the child was legalized. Their movement pattern in the 1970s, repeatedly changing homes coinciding with state adoption record audits, showed they were well aware of the illegality, or were instructed to move at specific times. Finally, the investigation team sketched a composite route map, starting from the Yazoo Forest area, south to Jackson, switching vehicles or handlers, continuing to Meridian, placing the child in the secret room, interstate movement to Louisiana or Alabama to erase traces, returning to Meridian after a few months to create the new birth certificate, beginning life under the identity Anna with all traces concealed behind walls and altered paperwork. This map not only showed the path of a missing child, but also the map of a shadowy system in operation: the driver, the woman in light clothing, the paperwork manipulator, the adoptive couple, each playing a role, creating a multi-year movement chain. Looking at the complete map on the meeting room wall, one investigator said, "A child couldn't travel that route alone. Someone led her, and the leader knew exactly how to erase tracks." The reconstructed 1969-1973 route became the key shaping the entire truth. Rachel was not the victim of a sudden disappearance, but of an organized child transfer network, moving through multiple points to erase origins, ending with creating a completely new identity. The investigation was no longer a missing person case, but tracing each link in that route, especially the woman in light-colored clothing, the figure appearing at every critical junction. The precise reconstruction of Rachel's movement route from 1969 to 1973 propelled the case into the legal phase. With the entire chain identified, the Mississippi Cold Case Task Force transferred the file to the state prosecutor's office to prosecute those still alive directly involved in concealing the missing child and creating a fake identity. Among all those who had appeared on the investigation map, only one remained alive with a clear role: Marjorie Hartwell, Anna's legally adoptive mother. Paul Hartwell had died in 1996, and the woman in light clothing remained unnamed, but Marjorie, nearly 80 years old, still lived in a nursing home in Tupelo. The decision to prosecute her was made in a 3-hour-plus meeting of the Historical Crimes Division. The reason was not that she was the mastermind, but that she was the only one in the chain with direct certification records, clear archived evidence, and signs of active participation in concealing the abducted child. The lead prosecutor read the indictment in court: forging a birth certificate in 1970, concealing the missing status of a child from another state, tampering with evidence through sealing the secret room, obstructing justice over decades. Although more than half a century had passed, crimes related to missing children and falsified public records had no statute of limitations under Mississippi law. Her involvement in any part of the process, removing Rachel from her real identity, was enough for the prosecution to open the case. When investigators arrived at the nursing home to arrest her, she didn't cry or react violently. Her face froze for a few seconds, as if she had always known this day would come. In the interrogation room, she spoke in a weak but clear voice: "I didn't take her, I just received her." But her subsequent statements only made her responsibility heavier. She admitted knowing the child was not the biological child of anyone on the paperwork, and that someone brought her on a cold night in December 1969. She didn't name the person, only describing wearing light clothing, with a central Mississippi accent. This immediately led investigators to associate her with the woman in light clothing who appeared throughout the route. In the second interrogation session, when asked to explain why the Hartwell house had a small sealed room, she said, "Paul did that. He said we had to wait for the paperwork to be processed, then let her live normally." This statement confirmed the room was built for the purpose of holding the child, rather than a random space. She didn't object to it, nor report it, meaning she willingly concealed it. But the biggest shock came from the statement of former Yazoo officer Eldon Price, who was re-interrogated when the file was expanded. When summoned to a special hearing in Jackson, Price appeared in poor health, using a cane, his face gaunt. He denied all charges related to the abduction, but when confronted with the signature on the 1970 birth certificate and the altered signature records in Rachel's file, he couldn't deny his handwriting. The silence lasted nearly a minute before he said, "I signed. But I signed thinking it was approved by superiors." Many in the room immediately took note. If this statement was true, it meant there was a higher figure who had given the green light for legitimizing a child taken from unknown origin. When asked why his name appeared on the Rachel file access list months after the disappearance was closed, Price answered faintly, "I was asked to check the file again. I didn't know which part was right or wrong." However, the most important part of Price's statement lay in the next admission. When asked why he didn't expand the search into the southern forest area the night Rachel disappeared, he replied, "Someone told me that was a direction that didn't need checking. I overlooked it." This was an admission of seriously neglecting duty, and an indication that he had received unofficial instructions from someone in the force or local government at that time. The prosecutor recorded the entire statement and determined charges against Price at 3 levels. 1. intentionally overlooking key clues in the missing child search, obstructing the investigation. 2. Participating in certifying a false birth certificate, beyond authority. 3. Unauthorized access and signs of altering public records, violating state archiving laws. Though his poor health did not allow full criminal prosecution, Price's statement helped the investigation team legitimize most legal suspicions about the fake identity creation process for Anna. The prosecutor noted his statement as highly valuable indirect evidence in establishing the intent to actively conceal. After weeks of work, the legal file exceeding 300 pages was completed. In it, the charges were summarized as follows. For Marjorie Hartwell, forging public documents felony, concealing a child's missing status felony, tampering with evidence felony, participating in an identity change network federal felony. For Eldon Price, violating law enforcement procedures felony, certifying false records felony, unauthorized access and modification of public records felony. For those deceased or missing, the court noted behaviors that could constitute crimes, federal kidnapping, transporting a child across state lines, staging illegal adoption records. These charges no longer had prosecutorial value due to the subjects being deceased, but were recorded in the summary indictment as part of the comprehensive picture. In the official announcement, the Cold Case Task Force representative stated, "No verdict can compensate for 55 years of a stolen life. But the law has a responsibility to record the truth, hold those involved accountable, and acknowledge the system's failure in letting a child disappear without protection." The first trial for Marjorie was scheduled within 3 months of indictment. Prosecutors determined to focus on 2 core points. She knew the child was not the biological child of the bringer, and she participated in concealing the real identity for years. Despite her advanced age, the law still held her accountable for her role. By this point, the case had entered a phase where every action had to be defined in legal terms, no longer in the realm of speculation. The concealer, the signer, those involved in legitimizing the identity, all had to face the consequences of what they left behind for half a century. And though no one had confessed the full truth yet, the shadow of the woman in light-colored clothing, the figure appearing at every nexus, now became the final focal point that the task force had to trace to close the 55-year broken circle. The hearings surrounding the Rachel case, or Anna Hartwell, sent shockwaves through the entire Mississippi judicial system. The way a child could be taken from her family, completely erased from public records, and then reappear with a new identity for over half a century, forced the state government to confront an uncomfortable truth. The record-keeping and missing child oversight systems had once contained serious vulnerabilities. The Cold Case Task Force's investigation report, over 200 pages long, was submitted to the Mississippi Department of Public Safety and immediately became the basis for a statewide reform effort. The director of the Department of Justice stated at a special session, "We cannot change the past, but we have a responsibility to ensure that no child in the future can be erased from life the way Rachel was erased." The changes began with the most obvious weakness, record storage. Standardizing all archived records from the 1950s, 1980s. A special committee was established to examine tens of thousands of birth, adoption, and missing child records from previous decades. Issues once dismissed as minor errors, faint signatures, missing pages, birth certificates without hospital verification, were now treated as signs requiring further investigation. A key part of the reform was digitizing all remaining paper records, cross-checking birth certificates against hospital birth lists, building an alert system for detecting mismatched signatures. The Rachel case made Mississippi realize that just one missing page, just one wrong signature, could create a gap large enough to conceal a child's fate for half a century. Mandatory internal audits of adoption records. One of the biggest shocks from the case was the existence of a 1970 adoption record, created using forms from an official batch, but bypassing social services procedures. This raised a series of similar suspicions. In the 18 months after the Rachel case came to light, Mississippi conducted a full audit of all adoption records, from 1965 to 1985, focusing on records with handwritten alterations, records missing biological parent information, records submitted by unnamed third parties, records bearing signatures from employees no longer assigned to the responsible department at the time. The audit results revealed over 70 records needing re-examination, with 9 classified as serious, showing signs similar to Rachel's case, paperwork legitimized by signatures lacking proper authority. This audit led to a broader review, re-examining the entire state adoption management system over half a century. Many records long considered valid now faced difficult questions. Were the children in those records truly who they claimed to be? Old forensics revived and reanalyzed. The Rachel case proved one crucial point that the investigation field had forgotten for decades. Evidence is never too old to become useless. The secret room, the shoes, the bow, items thought to have no value, were the keys that unlocked the case. This prompted Mississippi to launch a new project, Forensic Revival Initiative, allowing reanalysis of old evidence using modern technology, rescanning Polaroid images with color restoration algorithms, recovering faded signatures through spectroscopy. Since the project began, over 300 pieces of evidence stored for decades have been revived and reanalyzed. In many cases, seemingly minor details reopened long-forgotten investigations. Reopening multiple similar child disappearance cases. The Rachel case set a powerful legal precedent. A disappearance closed for decades could still be reopened if there were suspicions related to identity change. Mississippi's list of child cold cases, dense with incidents from the 1960s, 1990s, was placed under a new review program. The committee announced 14 cases to be reopened, including 5 involving duplicate birth dates in records, handwriting inconsistencies, children who suddenly appeared in records of childless families from that era. Some cases bore striking similarities to Rachel's: children vanishing near forests or dirt roads, a strange woman appearing in the area, a dark-colored car spotted near the scene, adoption registration records appearing 6-18 months later. Investigating these cases was not just about pursuing past accountability, but also determining whether a similar network had operated during that period. DNA genealogy becomes standard in Mississippi cold cases. No factor changed the entire Rachel case landscape as powerfully as DNA genealogy. After concluding Anna was Rachel, Mississippi made a historic decision: every cold case over 20 years old must be re-examined using genealogical DNA, if family samples or analyzable evidence exist. Laboratories partnered with GED Match, Family Tree DNA, and others to trace distant relatives, identify bloodlines, search matches by family branch, and compare through proxy samples when victim DNA was unavailable. Just 2 years after implementation, Mississippi reported 7 cases with victim identity confirmed, 4 cases with suspect matches through distant relatives, 2 cases with identities recovered for children lost in records, and over 30 files elevated to priority due to genealogical matches. This made Mississippi one of the leading southern states in applying genealogical DNA to cold case investigations. A new system from an old case. As the summary meeting concluded, a task force member said a line later quoted often by the press: "Rachel wasn't just found, she changed how we find people." The pages of records once forgotten in the cold storage of Yazoo County now became a lesson for the entire state. The wrong signatures, the small pieces of evidence, the secret room in an old house, all became reasons for Mississippi to overhaul its investigation system from the roots. From a 7-year-old child who vanished in 1969, Mississippi rebuilt an entire investigation standard, forcing the past to take responsibility and the future to be safer. In the year Rachel vanished, Mississippi was still a land where the line between law enforcement and everyday life sometimes blurred. Investigations relied on intuition more than procedure. Paperwork was handwritten, files stored with ink pens and paper clips, and a missing document page was not uncommon. When the case was closed early, and the file archived in cold storage, no one could imagine that those decisions at the time would bury a child's fate for half a century. To explain why the case lasted 55 years, investigation experts had to look at the big picture. initial errors, limited investigative capabilities, human interference, and decades-long legal gaps. The first cause came from the 1969 investigation process, which lacked standardization and relied too heavily on individual decisions. Key clues were not recorded or were downplayed, skewing the investigation from the very first days. At that time, Mississippi had no legal framework for high-risk child disappearance situations, no alert system, or federal coordination mechanism. A single mistake at the scene, no matter how small, could throw the entire case off track. Even reports lacking signatures or with irregular signatures went unscrutinized, allowing bad actors to exploit the loopholes to legitimize fake documents. The second cause stemmed from fragmented record storage. Tens of thousands of files in old buildings were kept in paper boxes and file clips, not digitized. When a page vanished, an entire case could change. The disappearance of the page describing the witness sighting of the car at Yazoo, a page the task force later determined had once been in the file, caused the vehicle-related investigative direction to be overlooked for decades. Additionally, officers being allowed to access and edit paper files without logging made any later review ambiguous. Rachel's case was the clearest evidence that lacking internal oversight mechanisms could have consequences lasting decades. The third cause was deliberate human interference, specifically those who helped build a completely new identity for the missing child. The fake birth certificate being signed, the small room being sealed, and the secret handover points on the route from Yazoo to Meridian all showed hands directed by multiple individuals. This interference made the case nearly unsolvable, relying only on 20th century technology and procedures. This is why the case was clinically dead for nearly 50 years. However, those very fragments, when re-examined with modern forensic tools, became the keys to the case. The breakthrough chain came not from a single discovery, but from the resonance of multiple factors: old items, lost file pages, a Polaroid photo, buried witness statements, and finally DNA genealogy. The first breakthrough came from physical evidence: the children's shoes, wooden toy, blanket in the secret room. Those items contained no clear DNA, but they raised questions. Why did the Hartwell house have belongings of a child exactly Rachel's age? Evidence doesn't speak in words, but its location, timing, and context created a logical picture no one could refute. The second breakthrough came from lost files and altered pages. When handwriting and signature experts reanalyzed the samples in the 1970 adoption file, they noticed an unusual match with the signature of an officer who had handled Rachel's case. Faded ink traces, letter flourishes, stroke slant, all exposed a truth no one had dared assert before: the files had been deliberately tampered with. The third breakthrough appeared through the 1971 Jackson Festival Polaroid photo, misplaced in old newspaper archives. Upon reanalyzing the image, experts noticed the child standing next to a woman in light-colored clothing, the same one multiple witnesses had mentioned at different times. Small details like stance, face, and even sunlight shadows on the ground all matched the timing and location descriptions. The fourth breakthrough came from late witnesses: an elderly woman who saw a child being put into a car in Baton Rouge, a man who remembered a light-colored clothing shadow at night in Newton. For years they hadn't spoken out of fear of trouble, or not knowing which case it related to. When their words came in, the pieces on the map began fitting together. And finally, the most important breakthrough was DNA genealogy. When Rachel's file was uploaded to the DNA genealogy system, distant relative matches appeared and opened a door no one expected. Anna Hartwell, a woman nearly 60 living in Montana, had blood relation to the Dwyer family. A single match changed the entire case landscape. DNA genealogy was seen as the tool powerful enough to pierce 55 years of silence, stripping away all the fake paperwork that had covered Rachel's real identity. The case's impact went far beyond Mississippi. Neighboring states, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, began reviewing missing child records from the 1960s, 80s. The FBI updated new guidelines on handling old files, emphasizing digitization, evidence preservation, and mandatory storage of fingerprints or family DNA samples in every child disappearance case. Federal investigation training schools incorporated Rachel's case into curricula on historical investigation errors, stressing the importance of re-examining paper files, cross-checking handwriting, and using modern forensic recovery technology. Both veteran officers and young investigators were trained on how to reread seemingly minor evidence containing big information and how to recognize signs of tampered files. From a legal standpoint, Mississippi had to amend multiple laws related to adoptions, birth record storage, and victim family data access rights in old files. From an operational standpoint, the state issued a new cold case investigation protocol. 1. Digitize all existing files. 2. Review handwriting and authenticate signatures. 3. Cross-check birth records against hospital records. 4. Reanalyze evidence using modern spectroscopy and DNA technology. 5. Upload information to genealogy databases for matches. 6. Re-interview late witnesses. 7. Compile movement routes of suspects. 8. Prosecute based on cumulative evidence, not just testimony. This protocol was regarded as the Mississippi cold case framework, later spreading to other states. When the case closed, a forensics expert said on television, "Rachel's case proves that time doesn't kill the truth, time just hides it." And precisely by piecing together each crack, a toy, a paper page, a signature, a photo, a witness, a DNA sample, the door sealed for over half a century was opened. Rachel took 55 years to be returned to her real name. But that journey not only illuminated one case, it reshaped how a state, even a nation, investigates long-term disappearances. From the darkness of a small hidden room, a new standard in cold case investigations was born. The story of Rachel Dwyer is not just a journey to reclaim an identity after 55 years, but also a mirror reflecting challenges that still exist in American society today, in record management, in the child protection system, and in civic responsibility. The fact that a child could vanish from Yazoo City in just minutes, then be taken across multiple states without anyone noticing, reveals the fragility of community safety when information is not properly stored or cross-checked. Today in the digital age, that lesson remains fully relevant. Accurate, transparent, and systematic data storage is not just the duty of public agencies, but also the responsibility of every family when monitoring children, registering records, or providing information to authorities. The way an old Polaroid photo from Jackson or a late statement from Newton could change the entire case reminds us that every detail matters. This applies to everyday American life, when noticing something unusual in the neighborhood, witnessing suspicious behavior in a parking lot, or seeing a child asking for directions in a panicked state. Don't ignore it. Report it. Speak up. The story also highlights the value of new technology like DNA genealogy, which helped identify Rachel at a time when paper records were no longer sufficient. In today's United States, where multi-generational families are scattered across states, this technology not only solves cases, but also heals families, reunites lost relatives, and brings transparency to the past. Ultimately, the case shows that prolonged community silence can inadvertently aid wrongdoing. Conversely, a witness daring to speak out after many years can save an entire life. The lesson for modern America is clear: civic responsibility, information transparency, and community strength are the only factors that can prevent tragedies like Rachel's from happening again. Thank you for joining us in bringing Rachel's truth back to light after more than half a century. If you believe stories like this need to continue being told, please hit subscribe to join us in preserving memory and justice for the forgotten. See you in the next video, where we continue seeking the truth and ensuring no story gets buried by time.